Okay, so final session, curating slash creating, building the epic. So one of the things which is relevant to what we've been talking about, I think, is the relationship between form and content in writing. So you might have a certain content, i.e. These concepts, these pairs of inversions that we were talking about, night and day, light and matter, day and night. That's one example of content. And then you have the form, which are the various formats that we've been trying out, experimenting with. So the Chinese poetry formats, the sonnet, the limerick, the haiku, all of these different kinds of formats, and not just poetic forms, different types of the way language is used. These are all different forms of how you can write. So the relationship between the form and the content is really important, and they are not separate, completely separate entities. And one of my favorite quotations in order to illustrate this point is from Samuel Beckett. And this is from an essay which Beckett wrote primarily about James Joyce, but also about these other, in the title, Dante, Bruno, Vico, Joyce. So we've got Dante, Giordano Bruno, kind of occult thinker. We have Giambattista Vico, who wrote a text called The New Science. And then we have Joyce, who at this point was in the process of writing Finnegan's Wake. So this is post Ulysses had already been published. Anyway, what Joyce is saying here, what Beckett is saying here is that in Joyce's writing, the content is the form. Now that's an extreme position, but what he says here about form is really interesting. So I'll read it for you. He says, the form that is an arbitrary and independent phenomenon can fulfill no higher function than that of stimulus for a tertiary or quaternary conditioned reflex of dribbling comprehension. So it's kind of funny and deliberately quite verbose, as in there's lots of words there, and it has the word dribbling in it, which is kind of funny. But what's interesting is that the point he's making is that, hang on, let somebody in. The relationship between the form and the content is important. And if a form and a content are arbitrary and independent phenomena, as in if we view them as completely independent from one another, then all we're going to get is this dribbling, this tertiary or quaternary conditioned reflex of dribbling comprehension. We're not going to get a great deal of meaning if we think about form and content as separate, unmotivated entities. So what that means for writers is that we must always think about the relationship between the form and the content. And I think this is really important. And it doesn't mean that the form and the content need to be identical, matched in some way. It just means that the relationship between them is a point at which you can exercise your creativity. So you might actually create some kind of juxtaposition between the form and the content. You might have some super serious content and a super playful form, or you might have the other way around. You might have some very playful, light-hearted content and then a very serious format in which to express it. And all of these different tensions and also inversions in that way create different effects. So that's why, that's what I wanted to just highlight that for you, because what we'll do later is we'll pick out different elements and concepts to talk about and then pick different formats in which to write about them, or just to articulate them. And I think I encourage you to think about the relationship between those two things. Okay. So now moving on, and I just wanted to show you briefly some other examples of interesting text from avant-garde writers, because we spent quite a long time 2 sessions ago talking about surrealism. And then we looked last week at T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which is an example of what some literary critics called high modernism, which I don't really think is that useful a term, don't really know what it means, but quite literary, full of references, quite difficult to understand. That was Eliot. These examples from Marinetti are from Futurism. So he's the founder of Futurism, wrote the manifesto, Futurist Manifesto, and yeah, not the nicest of guys, as far as people say, dodgy politics and glorifying war and fascist and just not great in those ways. And yet his typographical experimentation is very interesting. So that's why I show you this. And the futurists talked about words in freedom, which was about lifting words out of their preconceived meaning and setting them free to mean kind of anything. And these kind of gestures are interesting from the perspective of creative writing. So we can just lift these kind of tools or these kind of styles out of the context of this early avant-garde movement and think about how we can use them. And you can see from these examples how concrete poetry or sound poetry have been influenced by Marinetti, because he's making the text different sizes, different directions, different shapes. He's using kind of chance also in his spatial arrangement, the same way that when we looked at Mallarmé and also Apollinaire with the calligrams. Then also with the sound, this zang tum tum, these are kind of nonsense words in any language, whether Italian or otherwise, and they're meant to sound like the sounds of war, bombs or guns or aggressive, violent sounds. So that's futurism. It's kind of interesting for us to think about nowadays in terms of what we can do with text. That's one example we can mobilize ourselves. In the same kind of era, a little bit later, another avant-garde movement that's interesting for us to think about nowadays is Dada. So here one of the most significant proponents of Dadaism is Hugo Ball. And there's a picture of him there wearing his funny costume that he would dress up in to recite his poetry. For example, this nonsense poem Caravana, and the words there, Yolifanto Bambla or Fale Bambla. This is a nonsense, also kind of a nonsense sound poem. So we can also take this as an interesting example that you could think about how to play around with as well. And one thing which I think is interesting in terms of the relationship between content and form is the fact that this seems kind of silly, lighthearted. Nonsense makes us think of kind of childlike, funny, silly connotations. And yet, when he performed it, it was that even in this costume with this funny lobster claw hands and his hat, and it's just, I find it quite funny. And yet for him, this was extremely serious and recited with real seriousness, which again creates an interesting tension between the concept and the form. So this is another just example of how to, lift this out of its context, think about what you could do with nonsense words. We talked about nonsense words earlier on in the course. So I just wanted to briefly talk about them because this kind of adds to the trio of early avant-garde movements with surrealism, Dada, and futurism, all of which are really important in a historical way for influencing the kind of avant-garde of today, which you could say, arguably, is based in some of these experimentations that we looked at the beginning of the course with Kenneth Goldsmith and the uncreative writing, the use of quotations, and with the Xenoteca and Ask Alice, also the use of quotations, or maybe Craig Dworkin we looked at with the use of this kind of lexicographical poetics or the parsing. These are all examples of contemporary avant-garde writing. And they're all very aware of these early avant-garde movements. So I think the avant-garde in general is a really useful, all of these different movements and periods are useful because they're playful. This is one thing which unites all of these. Stylistically, they are playful, even if they are serious at the same time. And that's something I think is really useful if that's something you can play in your own writing. Okay, so I just wanted to also give you a very brief bit of context for the idea of free verse, which last week we were looking at The Wasteland, that is written in free verse. So rather than these very strict formats with a certain number of syllables and a certain number of lines, such as with the Chinese formats or with the traditional sonnet, free verse is free. It's organic, it's flexible, it can do different things, it's not regular, it's imperfect, and it's linked to the chance element that we talked about with that roll of the dice and chance, that poem that we looked at last week. So the idea of poetry being an exact science in free verse is not quite the same, but that does not mean to say it's not rigorous, it's not balanced, it doesn't make use of different sound symbolisms or symmetries, because I think it often does. And that you may find within free verse suddenly two lines which are completely balanced with a rhyme or a rhythm, and then it will do something else. So there's definitely more variety. And there's a quotation there from T.E. Hume, who wrote in free verse, saying, and it's a kind of reaction to romantic poetry, which is more regular, more conventional in its format. Free verse is more connected to the, I would say, 20th century writing. Okay. I'll read that for you. So T.E. Hume says, "We no longer believe in perfection, either in verse or in thought. We frankly acknowledge the relative. We shall no longer strive to attain the absolutely perfect form in poetry. Instead of these minute perfections of phrase and words, the tendency will be rather towards the production of a general effect. This, of course, takes away the predominance of meter and a regular number of syllables as the element of perfection in words. We are no longer concerned that stanzas shall be shaped and polished like gems, but rather that some vague mood shall be communicated. In all the arts, we seek for the maximum of individual and personal expression, rather than for the attainment of any absolute beauty. So I think there's various things being raised there, not all of which, I'm not putting this as something to follow very directly, but this is just how T.E. Hume was describing free verse, which you can draw on yourselves if you want to. Okay, so in addition to what we already talked about with these avant-garde movements of futurism, Dada, and surrealism, you also have Imagism. And this is also a kind of an avant-garde movement. It's a little bit later than the other ones, but there's some overlap as well. This is also from the 20th century. And Imagist poems are not completely dissimilar to the Chinese formats that we looked at with Tai, because they are also very short, very condensed, and often without so many of the function words. So they are short, intense, and they present a visual image. And this is also a reaction against long, flowing, flowery, romantic poetry of the 19th century. So I find these very beautiful, these short poems, and this also could be a format that you could play with. So I will show you a couple of examples, one from HD, who was a very interesting figure. Her full name was Hilda Doolittle. She was an American poet, but she just went by the initials HD, which is very unusual for a woman of that time. So she was an interesting figure. And Ezra Pound, very flamboyant, kind of performative kind of guy who would wear very wild clothes. So they're both interesting, slightly eccentric figures, and they were friends, and they both wrote these kind of short Imagist poems. So I'll show you. This one is from HD, called Oriad, and an Oriad is a sea nymph of some kind. I'll read it for you. Whirl up, sea, whirl your pointed pines, splash your great pines on our rocks, hurl your green over us, cover us with your pools of fur. So it's very simple and short, but there's a lot of movement in this poem. So the image, if it's creating an image, the image is not static, the image is moving. And as you can see, there are repetitions, and there are little sound, kind of little half rhymes. So you have whirl and hurl and fur, all of which have similar vowel sounds. And it's as though the speaker is commanding the sea to whirl up. But what's interesting is that it's as though the sea is made of pines. And so the sea is green, it's made of pines, and it's made of fir. 1 second. Fir is a kind of like a pine tree. So it's one of those kind of evergreen trees which is still has needle leaves in the wintertime. Fir is one of those, just a little bit different from pine trees. Both, well, no, fir trees are more like Christmas trees in the style, but they're quite similar. So pines and firs, two types of trees, and the sea is being commanded to kind of whirl up and cover the rocks, but it's a sea that's made of a forest. So there's a kind of clash or a meeting of sea and forest. And these kind of elemental figures of sea and forest are really strong. And to put them together, this is a very intense and kind of yeah, it's a very intense move or a very intense gesture done in 6 lines, very short ones as well. So that's HD. It was from a collection called Sea Garden, I think. And I'm a big fan. I think her poetry is powerful. Okay, I'll show you another one. Even shorter. This is a very famous example, maybe the most famous example, Ezra Pound, in a station of the metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So a bough is a branch of a tree. You just have 2 lines, and they also have some similar rhythm and some half rhyme sounds, because crowd and bough have the same sound, the same vowel sound. And there's something about the rhythm which makes, when you read it out loud, even though there are lots more syllables in the first line, you slow down the second line so that they both take the same amount of time to read, and it sounds like they are meant. There's a kind of rhythm, parallel of rhythm of those 2 lines. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. This is another extremely powerful visual juxtaposition, I would say, because you have, again, a surprising putting together of faces in a crowd, an urban scene in a station of the metro, and then you have a more rural scene, petals on a bough, petals on a wet black bough. So to put these, kind of splice these 2 images together, it's a metaphorical maneuver, but it's putting 2 worlds together in the same way that the previous poem is putting 2 worlds together, the world of the sea and the world of the forest. So you can see the power that these kinds of poems can somehow harness, just through and there's no story, there's no, in this one, there's no speaker, there's no action, there's no verbs, there's just an apparition. So the faces appear in the crowd, or there's a kind of apparition of the faces. And the next line about the petals makes you think that they look like the petals on the wet black bough. But it's just a quick snapshot kind of image. So these Imagist poems are another kind of format that you can play with. Just to give you some more context about how Imagist poetry was, how they wrote about it at the time. So Amy Lowell, another Imagist poet, American poet, she wrote, she edited an anthology of these poems, and she wrote in the introduction kind of instructions, because this was the time when everybody wrote manifestos for their kind of writing, like the futurists, realist, and Dada manifestos. So she said, poets should strive to use the language of common speech, to create new rhythms, to allow absolute freedom of choice in the choice of subject, to present an image, to produce poetry that is hard and clear, never blurred nor indefinite. Finally, most of us believe that concentration is of the very essence of poetry. So when she says concentration, that means about the intensity that's concentrated down into a short, intense, powerful form. And then this text from Ezra Pound, which was basically an Imagist manifesto, called A Few Don'ts by an Imagiste. And he says, an image is that which presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. It is the presentation of such a complex instantaneously which gives that sudden sense of liberation, that sense of freedom from time limits and space limits, that sense of sudden growth, which we experience in the presence of the greatest works of art. So this is interesting because it talks about a release from space and time. It's almost as though this Imagist poem is meant to be somehow transcendent, somehow. But it's the relationship to time and space is very interesting. So the image in the poem presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. So even just to hold on to that description is when you're doing your writing could be useful, could be fruitful for you. So that's Imagism. Okay, so Imagist poetry, that's just another one to add to your list of styles that we've tried out. I'm now getting some lists down of potential styles, and these lists are not exhaustive. There are many other examples of styles or voices or forms that you could think of, I'm sure. But going back to James Joyce's Ulysses, which is always a useful resource, I think, to mobilize your creativity. I'm just going to let this person in. The styles we have in Ulysses: interior monologue, journalistic headlines, musical fugue, romantic fiction, advertising language, play script, a fantasy or a dream, deliberate logorrhea, which is verbal diarrhea, so you can't stop talking, or that the use of that deliberately for comic effect, a stream of consciousness, anecdotal storytelling, poetry, fragments of song lyrics, Gothic novel style, a Catholic catechism, Latin prayers, and then very many different styles of the English language throughout history. So these are all, and there are many more of the styles which are used in Joyce's Ulysses. So that was 1922. If we were to add some more up-to-date styles or ways in which you can use language, you might have a list such as email, blog post, text message, Facebook post or comment or thread, an Instagram bio post, comment or thread, a transcript of TikTok video, a script for a television series, a poem of any format, a song, fiction of any genre, the text of targeted online advertising, spam or junk mail, fantasy, a meme, quotations like we've talked about, or just conversation, transcript of a conversation. Again, there are other examples which you could think of, but these are all formats which you could draw on to put together your final text. Okay, so that's the form. Let's go back then to the content. So you've all looked at Ludger's text. I hope you all have by this stage. And this slide is a work in progress, which is my map of the whole of Ludger's text, where I've kind of pulled out bits which somehow create the skeleton of what he's saying, and it's very, for me, very, and I'm still working on it. I want to put them in different places, and because there are many different connections, which are not all rendered clearly yet here, but I wanted to try and put these, and these are parts which I pulled out as interesting and kind of taught me things about how his thinking is working. So it was good to have this all on one slide. So yeah, you can do that if that is useful for you. But I just wanted to show you this so that you can then come back to this as a reference point if it's useful, and find things that you could write about creatively, further things than we've already tried out. Because you can see on the left-hand side with the circle and the line and the numbers and the letters, these are things which we started with. But there are many other things you could pick. So, but for today then, here are some highlighted bits, some of which we've worked with, some of which we haven't. So I just picked out some which today, for today, can be our content. So we've got the numbers equals time equals hearing equals doing, characters equals space equals seeing equals talking. So if you look at the inversions, you've got numbers and characters. Characters are the same as letters, time and space, hearing and seeing, doing and talking. And then you've got matter and energy and gravity, matter, light, that other highlighted bit. Then we have the old reality as continuous, the new playing in time, not in space. We have encoding and decoding. We have information as paradoxical. We have the description of ancient Greek and phonetic writing, Renaissance drawing, and then 20th century in code. Computers as instruments, not as tools. And then we have the rotation of these elements. So we have earth, air, fire, and water, geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, and music. We have geometry, logic, arithmetic, and algebra. And the axes around which these elements rotate is an invariant. So these are just some of what you could pick. I just suggested these ones for us to think about today. So this is building up to an exercise. I've now pulled out those selected bits, and they are there on the left-hand side. And then you have 3 lists now. You have the list from Joyce's Ulysses of styles or forms. You have the list of more up-to-date forms, which I read out. And then we have another list of poetic forms and devices, which we've talked about nearly all of these and tried out nearly all of these. But I thought it would be useful to have these also listed out. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. There are more, which you could think about. So we have the nonsense poem. We have the long epic poem. We have the modernization of a mythological figure, like we looked at with Kay, Tempest, and Tiresias also in the Wasteland. We have the limerick, the surrealist poem. We have concrete poetry. We have calligrams. We have sound poetry, sonnet, prose poem, Chinese formats, blank verse, free verse, haiku, syntactic defamiliarization, which you can see in the work of Gertrude Stein, which we haven't, some of you will have talked about Stein in other courses, but if you want to talk about it, we can later. Imagist poetry, as we've looked at today, and sound symbolism. So lots of different forms to try out there. So the next stage is going to be the putting together of the form and the content. So this is the same as I just talked you through. I invite you to take one of these highlighted bits from the map of Ludger's text, start to write a text using one of these elements as the theme, and then use one of the styles or poetic forms that are listed here. Pick one of them. And if you think of something different of your own, you're welcome to use that. So it's the same kind of exercise as we have done before, but a little bit more complex in that you have more to choose from. So all I ask, it's up to you how you do this. All I ask is that you think about the relationship between the content and the form. So if you're writing about time and space, how does that relate to the form that you've chosen out of one of these lists? Depending on time, we might do another go of this. So we'll see how we get on.